The lawyer had already divided everything my mother owned when he placed the burned cookbook in front of me. My brother received her house. My sister received the investment account. I received a book with a blackened spine, warped pages, and the faint smell of smoke still trapped inside its cover. My brother leaned back in his chair and smiled as though our mother had reached from beyond the grave to confirm what he had always believed about me, that I was the dependable daughter, useful in a crisis, but never important enough to inherit anything valuable. Then the lawyer opened the cookbook to page 47. A brass key fell onto the table. Behind it, written in my mother's careful handwriting, were 11 numbers, the name of a bank I had never heard her mention, and one sentence that changed everything I believed about my family. Laura, this is the account they tried to erase. For several seconds, no one spoke. My sister stopped turning the diamond ring on her finger. My brother's smile disappeared, and across the table, my mother's financial advisor quietly closed his briefcase. At the time, I did not know who they were. I did not know why a woman who had spent the final years of her life worrying about grocery prices had hidden a bank key inside a ruined cookbook. And I certainly did not know why 3 people in that room seemed to understand the message before I did. But I knew one thing. My mother had not left me a cookbook. She had left me evidence. Good day, dear listeners. It's Nora again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Laura Bennett. I was 46 years old when my mother died, and I worked as a forensic billing analyst for a regional hospital system in Columbus, Ohio. That title sounds more dramatic than the job usually was. Most days, I sat beneath fluorescent lights reviewing insurance claims, correcting coding errors, and tracing payments that had been applied to the wrong patient accounts. I was not a detective. I did not carry a badge. I carried reading glasses, a stainless steel coffee cup, and a legal pad covered with numbers. But records have personalities. Honest records fit together even when they are complicated. Dates align, signatures appear where they should, totals reconcile. Dishonest records require excuses: a missing page, a changed address, a payment posted on a holiday, a signature that looks almost right. I had spent 19 years learning that errors rarely travel alone. One small inconsistency usually led to another, and another, until the pattern became too deliberate to dismiss. My personal life was much less orderly. I had been divorced for 7 years. My ex-husband, Daniel, was not cruel, but he had spent most of our marriage making decisions that affected both of us, and explaining them only after they were finished. When I finally left, I moved into a modest 2-bedroom townhouse near Westerville and learned that loneliness was sometimes quieter than marriage. I had one daughter, Emily, who was 23 and teaching English in South Korea. We spoke every Sunday morning. She worried that I worked too much. I worried that she ate enough vegetables. It was an arrangement that made both of us feel useful. My mother, Margaret, had lived alone in the same small brick house where my siblings and I grew up. After my father died, she refused every suggestion that she sell it. The pipes complain, she used to say, but so do I. We understand each other. She had been a cafeteria manager at an elementary school for 32 years. She knew how to feed 400 children with a budget designed for 300. She clipped coupons, repaired her own curtains, and saved rubber bands in a ceramic bowl beside the telephone. She was not wealthy, at least, that was what I believed. My older brother, Thomas, was 51 and owned 2 car dealers outside Dayton. He was charming in the polished way of men who rarely hear the word no. He remembered birthdays when people were watching and forgot them when they were not. My younger sister, Rebecca, was 42 and married to a commercial real estate attorney named Stephen. She had always been closer to Thomas than to me. They shared the same social instincts. They knew how to enter a room and identify the person with the most influence before removing their coats. I was different. I noticed the person standing alone beside the coat rack. My mother never openly favored any of us, but during the last 3 years of her life, I became the one who took her to medical appointments, organized her prescriptions, and repaired the small failures of an aging house. Thomas paid for a new furnace once and mentioned it at every Thanksgiving afterward. Rebecca ordered groceries through an app and called it Managing Mom's Nutrition. I showed up on Wednesday evenings with soup. I do not say that to make myself sound noble. Resentment is easy to disguise as virtue. And there were nights when I sat in my car outside my mother's house, wishing someone else had remembered the cardiology appointment. But once I walked inside and saw her sitting beneath the yellow kitchen light, the resentment usually softened. She had begun changing during the final year. Not dramatically. There were no wild accusations or obvious confusion. Her mind remained sharp. She still beat me at Scrabble and corrected television meteorologists who used the phrase historic storm too freely, but she became guarded. She started lowering her voice when she spoke on the phone. She asked me twice whether I had ever worked with offshore billing companies. She wanted to know how banks verified signatures on old accounts. Once, while I was sorting her medications, she stood in the kitchen doorway and asked, "If a number disappears from one statement but appears in another, which one do you trust?" "The original source," I told her. She nodded as though I had answered something larger. I asked what she was looking at. "Nothing yet," she said. That word stayed with me. Not nothing, nothing yet. A month later, I found a stack of bank envelopes in her recycling bin. The return address belonged to Harrison Private Bank in Cincinnati. I had never heard of it. The envelopes had been opened carefully along the top, but the contents were gone. When I asked her about them, she took the envelopes from my hand and placed them beneath a newspaper. Old paperwork. From a private bank, they make ordinary things sound expensive. Her tone was light, but she did not meet my eyes. I could have pressed her. Instead, I let it go. That decision troubled me later. 3 weeks before she died, my mother called me at work. Her voice was low. "Laura, is there a way to prove someone changed a file after it was signed?" "Yes. Sometimes metadata, ink analysis, version history, witness records. It depends on the file." "What about a trust?" I stopped typing. "What trust?" There was a pause. Then I heard a man's voice in the background. My mother said, "I have to go." "Mom, who's there?" "No one you need to worry about." The call ended. That evening, I drove to her house without warning. A silver sedan was pulling away from the curb as I arrived. I only saw the first 3 letters of the license plate. Inside, my mother was wiping the kitchen table with unnecessary force. 2 coffee cups sat beside the sink. "Who visited?" "Mr. Cole." I knew the name. Richard Cole had managed my parents' retirement savings for nearly 25 years. He attended my father's funeral, sent Christmas baskets, and spoke about our family as though he were part of it. He was calm, silver-haired, and unfailingly polite. What did he want? To review some paperwork. At night, he was nearby. My mother folded the dishcloth into a perfect square. "Laura, promise me something." "What?" "If Thomas or Rebecca ask whether I gave you any documents, tell them no." I stared at her. "Did you give me documents?" "No." "Then why would they ask?" She looked toward the dark window above the sink. "Because people become curious when they are afraid." That was the closest she came to telling me the truth. 12 days later, she suffered a stroke. She died the following morning without regaining consciousness. Grief did not arrive as a single blow. It came through ordinary objects: her slippers beside the bed, a half-used roll of paper towels, a note on the refrigerator reminding herself to buy cinnamon. At the funeral, Thomas delivered a polished speech about family legacy. Rebecca cried against Stephen's shoulder. Richard Cole stood near the back of the church and placed one hand over his heart when the choir began. I watched all of them and felt ashamed of my suspicion. Death can make distrust seem cruel. The will reading took place 9 days later at the office of Martin Hale, my mother's probate lawyer. Martin was in his late 60s, with a narrow face and the tired patience of a man who had watched families argue over silverware. Thomas arrived first. Rebecca and Stephen came together. Richard Cole sat at the far end of the conference table, officially present because he managed several assets named in the estate. The will appeared simple. The house went to Thomas. A brokerage account containing approximately $280,000 went to Rebecca. Personal belongings were to be divided equally, except for several named items. Then Martin reached the final bequest. To my daughter, Laura Bennett, I leave my personal cookbook. including all handwritten additions and materials contained within. Thomas laughed softly. Rebecca said, "That sounds like Mom." I said nothing. Martin's expression did not change. An assistant brought in the cookbook inside a clear archival bag. I recognized it immediately. It had once been red, with a picture of a copper pot on the cover. My mother kept it beside the stove throughout my childhood, but there had been a kitchen fire when I was 16. A towel caught fire near the gas burner, and smoke damaged several cabinets. The cookbook had been badly burned. I thought she had thrown it away. Martin removed it from the bag and placed it before me. "Your mother gave this to me 6 months ago," he said. "She instructed me to deliver it exactly as received." Richard Cole shifted in his chair. It was a small movement, but I noticed. I opened the cover. The pages were brittle at the edges. Old recipes appeared in my mother's handwriting. Pot roast, apple cake, chicken with dumplings. Martin said, "She also instructed me to direct you to page 47. That was when the key fell out. It was taped inside a hollow carved through several pages. Beneath it was a folded deposit receipt from Harrison Private Bank. The account number ended in the same 11 digits my mother had written beside the message. "Laura, this is the account they tried to erase." Martin turned to Richard Cole. "Mr. Cole, were you aware Mrs. Bennett maintained an account at Harrison?" Richard's face remained composed. I'm afraid Margaret had become increasingly confused about her finances. It was the speed of his answer that unsettled me. He did not ask to see the receipt. He did not express surprise. He explained it. Thomas reached for the page, but I closed the book. "What does they try to erase mean?" he asked. "I don't know." Rebecca looked at Richard. He gave her the smallest shake of his head. That was the moment I understood. There was a conversation happening in the room that did not include me. Martin slid the cookbook back into the archival bag. "Mrs. Bennett left additional instructions," he said. "Laura is to visit Harrison Private Bank alone. She may consult independent counsel, but no beneficiary or estate advisor is authorized to accompany her." Thomas's face hardened. "That is absurd." Martin looked at him over his glasses. "It is legally specific." Richard folded his hands. "Laura, I would advise caution. Older people are frequently targeted by fraudulent banking schemes. Give me the account information, and I'll verify it through professional channels." His voice was kind. That made it more dangerous. I held the bag against my chest. No, it was not dramatic. I simply said no. Richard smiled as though I had misunderstood him. "Of course, when you've had time to process everything." I did not know it yet, but that was the first mistake he made. He assumed grief had made me weak. In reality, grief had made every detail sharp. I drove home with the cookbook on the passenger seat. For nearly an hour, I remained parked outside my townhouse. Rain moved across the windshield in thin silver lines. My phone lit up 4 times. Thomas, Rebecca. Thomas again, then Richard Cole. I answered none of them. Inside, I placed the cookbook on my kitchen table, made coffee, and began a list. At work, when an account does not reconcile, emotion is irrelevant. You begin with what can be verified. I wrote, "Harrison Private Bank, account number, brass key, mother's message." Richard knew too quickly. Rebecca looked at Richard before speaking. "Silver sedan at Mom's house. Question about altered trust. Missing bank statements." Then I turned the deposit receipt over. On the back, in pencil so faint I almost missed it, my mother had written another message. "Ask for box 314. Do not sign anything Cole prepared." I sat there for a long time. Fear is strange. It does not always make you small. Sometimes it makes you tidy. I photographed every page of the cookbook, the key, the receipt, and both handwritten messages. I uploaded the images to an encrypted drive and emailed copies to myself. Then I placed the originals in a fireproof document case. Only after that did I listen to the voicemails. Thomas sounded irritated. "Laura, call me. We need to discuss whatever Mom left you before this becomes a legal mess." Rebecca sounded concerned. "I'm worried you're being pulled into something fraudulent." Richard said Mom had been showing signs of paranoia. Richard sounded gentle. "Please do not approach Harrison alone. There may be serious tax consequences. I'm trying to protect you." 3 people, 1 message. "Do not investigate without us." That was when I made my first decision. I would investigate without them. The next morning, I called Martin Hale. Did my mother believe her will had been altered? There was a pause. I can't answer that fully over the phone. Can you answer partially? She believed documents bearing her signature existed that she had not knowingly approved. Did she identify Richard Cole? She instructed me to recommend independent counsel if you discovered anything at Harrison. He gave me the name of a probate litigator named Naomi Price. Naomi's office was above a bakery in downtown Columbus. She was 53, wore no jewelry except a plain wedding band, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Who currently controls your mother's estate records? Richard Cole provided most of them to Martin. Who benefits under the documents you have seen? Thomas and Rebecca. And what did your mother give you? I placed the cookbook, still sealed in its bag, on her desk. A reason not to trust the documents. Naomi read both handwritten messages. Then she said, "We do not confront anyone. We do not accuse anyone. We do not tell your siblings what you find. What do? We preserve evidence. We identify the account. We compare original documents against filed documents. And we assume that anyone willing to alter financial records may also be willing to alter the story around them." Her words were calm. That helped. I was not brave. I was careful. 2 days later, Naomi and I drove to Harrison Private Bank in Cincinnati. The building did not look like a bank. It occupied 3 floors of an old stone structure near Fountain Square. There were no teller windows, no ropes, and no advertisements for checking accounts. A receptionist led us into a private office. The bank officer was a woman named Evelyn Shaw. When I gave her the account number, her expression changed. "May I see your identification?" I gave it to her. She compared my signature against a document on her screen, then excused herself. 20 minutes passed. When she returned, another man accompanied her. He introduced himself as the bank's compliance director. Evelyn placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Your mother established a transfer on death account in 2008. You are the named beneficiary. How much is in it?" She looked at the compliance director before answering. "As of this morning, the account holds $3,842,000. The number did not feel real. I thought of my mother saving rubber bands. I thought of her comparing prices on canned tomatoes. Naomi asked, "What was the source of the funds?" Evelyn opened a file. Initial deposits came from the sale of privately held shares in Bennett Medical Packaging. My father had worked for that company for 29 years. He was a maintenance supervisor. At least, that was what we had been told. Evelyn continued. Additional funds came from dividend reinvestment and the sale of patent participation rights. I looked at her. My father held patents. According to the account documentation, he co-developed a sterilized packaging seal used in surgical supply containers. I remembered him bringing home pieces of plastic and metal from the plant. I remembered him spending evenings drawing small diagrams at the kitchen table. My parents had never told us those drawings became valuable. "Why hide it?" I asked. The compliance director answered, "Your mother left a letter in the safe deposit box explaining her reasons. Box 314 was located in a room behind 2 secured doors. The brass key fit. Inside was a blue accordion folder, a flash drive, 3 notarized affidavits, and a letter addressed to me. My hands shook when I unfolded it. My mother wrote that my father had received a confidential settlement in 2007 after the company sold technology based partly on his work. He had placed the money into a trust intended to provide equally for all 3 children after both parents died. But after my father's death, Richard Cole persuaded my mother to restructure the trust. At first, she believed the change was for tax purposes. Years later, she discovered that the new version gave Richard broad authority to move assets into entities controlled by advisors and family beneficiaries. She began investigating. The account at Harrison was the portion she managed to protect before the restructuring was completed. The letter continued. Thomas accepted money from Richard to purchase his first dealership. Rebecca's husband prepared documents related to the trust. I do not know whether your brother and sister understand the full scheme, but they have benefited from it. I chose you because you ask where numbers come from. I had to stop reading. There are sentences that divide your life into before and after. That was one of them. I chose you because you ask where numbers come from. Not because I was the least loved, not because she had nothing valuable left to give me, because she believed I would follow the record. The affidavits were from my mother, a retired bookkeeper from Bennett Medical Packaging, and a former assistant in Richard Cole's office. Together, they described transfers from my father's original trust into 4 limited liability companies. One company had purchased Thomas's first dealership property. Another had financed a commercial building partly owned by Rebecca and Stephen. A third paid consulting fees to Richard Cole. The fourth no longer appeared active, but the flash drive contained statements showing that more than $6 million had passed through it. Naomi leaned back in her chair. This is not only a probate dispute. What is it? Potential fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, forgery, possibly money laundering, depending on where the fourth company sent the funds. The truth had a weight of its own. I felt it settling across the table. The bank froze all non-routine activity connected to my mother's records and made certified copies of everything in box 314. Before we left, Evelyn showed us something else. 3 weeks earlier, someone had attempted to change the beneficiary on the Harrison account. The request named a family trust controlled by Richard Cole. The signature appeared to be my mother's. The request was dated 4 days after her stroke. My mother had been unconscious. That was the first concrete proof that someone had not merely pressured her in the past. They were still trying to take the money while she was dying. Naomi contacted federal investigators and filed an emergency petition in probate court to suspend distributions from the estate. Within hours, my phone began ringing. Thomas called at 11. Rebecca sent a message saying I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding. Richard left one voicemail. Laura, lawyers tend to escalate matters because escalation generates fees. There is still an opportunity to resolve this privately and preserve your mother's dignity. He never mentioned the forged form. He never asked what I had found. That told me he already knew. The next week became a lesson in pressure. Thomas accused me of jealousy. Rebecca said our mother had always been suspicious and secretive. Stephen sent Naomi a formal letter claiming the affidavits were unreliable because my mother's health had declined. Richard's attorney offered a private settlement. I could keep the Harrison account if I agreed not to challenge the estate, not to request records from the 4 companies, and not to speak with law enforcement. Naomi read the offer twice. They're willing to give up nearly $4 million, she said, to keep you from asking about the rest. That was when I understood. The account was not the main prize. It was the distraction. We hired a forensic accountant named Samuel Ortiz. Samuel treated financial records the way a physician treats scans. He did not look at one number. He looked for what the surrounding numbers were trying to hide. For 3 weeks, we worked through statements, property filings, trust amendments, and tax records. The original trust was straightforward. After both parents died, all assets were to be divided equally among the 3 children. The amended trust was different. It created management fees, advisory fees, property acquisition fees, loans to beneficiary-related companies. It also contained a clause allowing Richard to classify certain advances as family development distributions, which did not reduce the receiving beneficiary's final share. Thomas had received more than $1 million. Rebecca and Stephen had benefited from at least $900,000. None of it reduced what they inherited under the new documents. I had received nothing. Worse, the records showed that my mother's signature on the largest amendment had been notarized in Columbus on a day she was visiting me in Cleveland. I knew because we had attended Emily's university graduation. I had photographs, hotel receipts, and parking records. The notary stamp belonged to an employee in Richard's office. Samuel found the 4th company 2 days later. It had transferred money to an investment partnership in the Cayman Islands. The partnership's listed beneficiaries included Richard Cole and a trust bearing Stephen's initials. Rebecca's husband was not simply a lawyer who had prepared paperwork. He appeared to be one of the architects. A structure can look sound from the outside while every load-bearing wall has been cut. By then, I had begun seeing my family that way. The smiles were still there. The holiday photographs were still there. But the structure underneath had changed. The point of no return came when investigators recovered an email chain between Richard and Stephen. The messages began 6 years earlier. They discussed my mother's increasing questions. They discussed records before she requested a formal accounting. One message from Stephen read, "Laura is the only potential problem. She notices paperwork, but Margaret does not involve her in financial matters." Richard replied, "Keep it that way. Thomas can manage Laura emotionally if necessary." I read the sentence twice. There was something almost clinical about it. They had not seen me as a person. I was a risk category. A daughter who could be managed. A sister who would choose peace over conflict. They were nearly right. For most of my life, I had believed keeping peace meant absorbing discomfort so other people would not have to face it. But silence does not always create peace. Sometimes it only creates privacy for the person doing harm. Thomas came to my townhouse on a Sunday evening. He did not call first. I saw him through the window, standing beneath the porch light in a wool coat, holding a bottle of wine. I did not let him inside. We spoke through the partially opened door, while my phone recorded from the table behind me. Ohio law allowed me to record a conversation I was part of. Naomi had confirmed that twice. "You're making this worse than it needs to be," he said. "For whom? For everyone." Mom's signature was forged. His jaw tightened. "You don't know that." She was unconscious when the beneficiary form was signed. He looked away. Rain tapped against the porch railing. Richard said that was an administrative correction. "To transfer $4 million, you already have more than enough." There it was, not denial, entitlement. I asked, "Did you know where the money for your first dealership came from?" He adjusted his grip on the wine bottle. "Dad wanted me to succeed." "Did Dad tell you that?" Richard explained the arrangement. "After Dad died." Thomas's voice became softer. That was always when he was most persuasive. "Laura, listen to me. Families make private decisions. Not every document tells the whole story." "No," I said, "but every document tells part of it." He stepped closer. "If this becomes public, Rebecca could lose her marriage. Stephen could lose his license. My businesses could collapse. Is that what Mom would want?" I thought of her handwriting inside the cookbook. I thought of the account they tried to erase. Mom wanted the truth preserved. Thomas stared at me for several seconds. Then he placed the wine bottle on the porch. "You always needed to be the righteous one." "No, I needed the numbers to reconcile." I closed the door. My hands shook afterward, but I did not call him back. The civil complaint was filed the following morning. It named Richard Cole, Stephen, 2 former employees, and the associated companies. Thomas and Rebecca were added as parties because they had received disputed assets. Though the initial filing did not accuse them of designing the scheme, the probate judge suspended Richard's authority over the estate and appointed a neutral fiduciary. Subpoenas went to banks, title companies, accountants, and email providers. That was when the polite explanations began to collapse. Richard claimed my mother approved every transfer. Then investigators produced her affidavit. He claimed the transfers benefited all 3 children. Samuel produced a chart showing that I had received none. He claimed the amended trust was signed in his office with my mother present. I produced photographs of my mother standing beside me at Emily's graduation, 200 miles away. Stephen claimed his initials appeared in the offshore partnership by coincidence. Bank records showed legal fees paid directly to his firm. Rebecca said she knew nothing about the source of the property financing. Emails showed she had asked Stephen whether Mom's quiet account could interfere with their building purchase. The depositions took place over 4 months. I attended Richard's. He wore a navy suit and spoke with the same calm courtesy he had used at our Christmas dinners. Naomi asked, "Did Margaret Bennett ever accuse you of altering trust documents?" "No." She placed a letter before him. It was dated 8 months before my mother died and sent by certified mail. In it, my mother demanded original copies of every amendment and specifically questioned whether her signature had been duplicated. Richard studied it. "I don't recall receiving this." Naomi displayed the signed delivery confirmation. His signature appeared at the bottom. He adjusted his glasses. "I receive a great deal of correspondence. Do you frequently sign for letters accusing you of forgery?" His attorney objected. Naomi moved on. She asked about the post-stroke beneficiary form. Richard said his assistant prepared it from instructions my mother gave before her stroke. Where are those instructions? Oral. Who heard them? I did. No one else. Not that I recall. Naomi placed the original form on the screen. Why does the metadata show this document was created 2 days after Mrs. Bennett's stroke? For the first time, Richard stopped looking composed, only for a second. But records do not need long. They only need one opening. His assistant eventually accepted immunity in exchange for cooperation. She testified that Richard instructed her to create the beneficiary change after learning my mother might not survive. He gave her a scanned signature from an older form and told her the family had already approved the transfer. The notary admitted stamping the trust amendment without witnessing my mother sign it. Stephen's firm produced deleted emails after a court order threatened sanctions. One message contained a spreadsheet estimating how much each participant would receive once the Harrison account had been absorbed into the trust. My siblings' names were listed beside projected distributions. Mine was not. The probate hearing lasted 6 days. There was no dramatic confession. Real legal battles rarely end with someone standing and shouting the truth. They end with documents placed in the correct order, dates compared, questions repeated, explanations narrowed until there is no room left for them. Martin Hale testified that my mother had approached him privately after she found discrepancies in Richard's reports. She feared that directly challenging him would cause the remaining assets to disappear. Evelyn Shaw testified about the attempted beneficiary change. Samuel explained the movement of funds through the 4 companies. I testified last. Stephen's attorney tried to portray me as resentful. Your mother left the house to your brother, correct? Yes. And a substantial investment account to your sister. Yes, she left you a damaged cookbook. She left me the account and records concealed inside it. But before discovering the account, you believed you had received less than your siblings. Yes. Were you angry? I was grieving. That was not my question. I looked at the judge, then back at the attorney. I felt hurt for several minutes. Then the key fell out. A few people shifted in their seats. He asked whether I wanted my siblings punished. No. Yet your complaint could cost them significant money. My complaint asks the court to return money that did not belong to them. He showed me photographs of family holidays. Do these images represent a family you are willing to destroy? Naomi objected. The judge sustained it. But I answered in my own mind. The photographs did not show the destruction. They showed the wallpaper covering it. The judge issued her ruling 3 weeks later. She invalidated the amended trust documents due to fraud, improper notarization, and breach of fiduciary duty. The original trust was restored. Richard was removed permanently and ordered to repay fees, diverted assets, and damages. His professional licenses were suspended pending criminal proceedings. Stephen was referred to the state disciplinary authority and federal prosecutors. He later pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and falsifying financial instruments. The notary lost her commission. Richard's assistant received probation under her cooperation agreement. The offshore funds were frozen. Not all of the money was recovered, but most of it was. Thomas agreed to return the disputed equity tied to his first dealership property through a structured settlement. He kept his operating businesses but lost the illusion that their foundation had been entirely his own. Rebecca and Stephen divorced before the criminal case ended. She insisted for a long time that she had not understood what he was doing. I believe that was partly true. But not understanding is different from not wanting to know. She had seen enough to ask questions. She chose comfort instead. The restored estate, after taxes, legal fees, repayment agreements, and recovered assets, was divided according to my father's original trust. My share was substantial, more money than I had ever expected to possess. But the first thing I bought was not a luxury car. It was a new front door. The lock on my townhouse had begun sticking during winter. For years, I had lifted the handle while turning the key because replacing the door felt unnecessary. One cold morning, I realized I no longer wanted to struggle with an entrance to my own home, so I replaced it. Solid wood, a simple brass handle, a lock that turned easily. That purchase meant more to me than the account balance. I stayed at the hospital for another year, then reduced my hours and began consulting for nonprofit clinics dealing with billing fraud. I established a small fund in my parents' names to help cafeteria workers and school maintenance employees pay for professional training. People like my mother and father often create value that companies remember only after the workers are gone. I wanted someone to remember while they were still there. I sold my townhouse and bought a small house outside the city. It had a sunroom, 2 maple trees, and enough space behind the kitchen for a garden. The first spring, I planted tomatoes, rosemary, and more zucchini than any one person should grow. Emily came home for the summer and painted the guest room. We traveled once to Maine, where my mother had always wanted to see the coast. I carried a copy of her letter in my bag and read it one morning while sitting above the water. Thomas and I did not speak for nearly 18 months. Then he sent a handwritten note. It did not ask for forgiveness. It said, "I spent my life believing whatever benefited me must have been intended for me. I am trying to understand the difference. That was enough to begin." Rebecca called later. Our relationship remains careful. Healing is not the same as returning to the way things were. Some structures should not be rebuilt exactly as they stood. Sometimes the safest thing is to keep the foundation, remove what failed, and build smaller. The burned cookbook now sits in a glass front cabinet in my kitchen. I had it professionally preserved, but I asked the conservator not to repair the blackened edges. The damage is part of its truth. Page 47 is still hollow. The key remains taped inside, not because I need it anymore, because I want to remember that evidence does not always arrive in a folder marked important. Sometimes it hides inside an ordinary object everyone else has dismissed. Money was never the most important thing my mother left me. She left me proof that she had seen me clearly. She knew I would be hurt. She knew I would be pressured. She knew the people involved would sound reasonable and professional, and she trusted me to remain patient enough to let the truth speak. For years, I believed being the quiet person in a family meant I was the easiest to overlook. Now I understand that quiet people often see the most. We notice which story changes, which signature leans the wrong way, which person answers a question before it has been asked. We notice because we are listening while everyone else is performing. I did not become fearless. I learned that fear and careful action can exist in the same body. I did not defeat anyone through anger. I documented what happened, found people who understood the law, and refused to surrender the evidence for the comfort of silence. And I did not simply inherit money. I inherited the right to stop doubting what I could see with my own eyes. That is what finally made me free. So let me ask you something. What would you have done if your family told you to ignore the evidence in order to keep the peace? Would you have accepted the private settlement? Or would you have followed the records no matter where they led? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who may need the reminder that patience is not weakness, documentation is not cruelty, and the truth, however carefully someone tries to bury it, has a weight of its own.